Moving on to item number 5. This is a priority development area, the feasibility and readiness assessment. And Therese and Johnny, I guess you're presenting this morning.
Good morning, Commissioners and ABAG board members. I'm Therese Trivedi with MTC Planning, and I'm actually joined here with Darren Smith from the consulting firm Economic and Planning Systems, or EPS. And we are going to talk about some work that was recently completed that focused on the development, readiness, and feasibility of some of the PDAs in our region. We'll be talking a little bit about the purpose behind the work, how the analysis was conducted, as well as the results, and what do those results mean for the bigger picture going forward. So beginning with the study purpose, this work really evolved out of a meeting that we had with some developers and members of the business community last July. And in that discussion, the group raised some concerns about the amount of growth, particularly residential growth, that was projected for PDAs in Planned Bay Area, and questioning whether or not that was really feasible. So that became the primary work scope element of this work, to really estimate the ability of the PDAs to accommodate those residential units that were projected in Planned Bay Area. And while that was the first component, we all know that all the PDAs are not created equally. Some are better equipped than others to take on growth. And so a second element of our work plan was to really make sure that we examined policy initiatives that might be able to improve the development feasibility going forward over the 30 years of the plan if these were implemented. So that was a second piece of our work. And while PDAs are really the focus, the primary focus of the work, we did take a look at some non-PDA areas and those development constraints as well. And Darren will touch on that further in the presentation. But I also wanted to mention that we weren't starting from scratch with this work. Back in 2010, ABAG taking the lead, and MTC, we also did a PDA assessment trying to get at some of the answers to these questions. And we had established some criteria that we really built on for this work here today, and that was really the basis for where we started. And so I think the next slide will actually launch us into that work, and I will turn it over to Darren.
Great, thank you. Again, Darren Smith with Economic and Planning Systems. We began this work in the fall, and we were not starting from scratch, as Therese mentioned. Each of the jurisdictions that we've selected for review here had participated in 2010 in the assessment of the PDAs and filled out a fairly comprehensive survey, so we had a lot of baseline analysis to work from. But we wanted to freshen that up and also make sure that the information was sort of apples to apples among PDAs, because each of the jurisdictions had filled out their own assessments, perhaps their own criteria. So we were looking specifically at a number of criteria here for what constitutes readiness. That is, how much of the planned development is really available, or there is current capacity in the planning and other constraints. So one of the things we looked at was the housing capacity estimate. That's a physical assessment, as well as a zoning and entitlement assessment, existing planning and entitlement process, the level of community support for the types of development implicated under the PDA allocations, the attractiveness to the market, and finally the infrastructure capacity and needs. And again, we looked at the baseline readiness. That's essentially what is, under current conditions, what could we expect to be accommodated and achieved through 2040. And then in an amended readiness analysis, we assigned certain policy actions to the future and said, okay, if you do X, Y, and Z, and those differ from PDA to PDA, what might be expected under those circumstances? So we started with a selection of 20 different PDAs. There are, of course, over 160 PDAs, and we did not have the capacity to evaluate each and every one of them. So we looked for a representative sample of PDAs that is geographically distributed among all 9 counties, as well as being representative of the different place types. There are 7 different place types in the PDA categories. And then we also looked for places that had the full range of potential opportunities and constraints. So even if a place like Antioch and a place like Walnut Creek might be categorized in the same way, they might have very different kinds of market and physical constraints. So we wanted to capture that entire universe of really opportunities and constraints. The first thing that we looked at in each of these 20 PDAs was the housing capacity, and for that we looked at the opportunity sites. In some cases, the jurisdictions themselves had already prepared plans that corresponded to the PDAs that said, for instance, in North San Jose, they have planned capacity for 32,000 housing units, and that is the number that's been assigned to them through the Jobs Housing Connection allocation. And so that was one that was basically prepared for us. But we also, where that wasn't the case, we had to identify individual opportunity sites throughout the PDAs and assign zoning capacity to them and density capacity to them, and come up with what we felt was an achievable level of development through 2040 based on the physical capacity and the current planning and zoning in place. And we reviewed all of these assumptions with the different jurisdictions, typically the planning staff, sometimes public works and community development, and other staff members from the jurisdictions. So as we walk through this, rather than being sort of nebulous here, I do want to give an example. We looked at downtown Hayward as one of the 20 PDAs in our sample. So in the case of downtown Hayward, which is shown in that picture, we identified the opportunity sites that are highlighted in blue there and assigned zoning capacity. And in that case, we determined that the zoning capacity for sites that were underutilized or vacant actually exceeded the amount of development that is allocated to this PDA through the year 2040. That was not always the case among the 20 PDAs in the sample, but in Hayward that was the case. Then we looked at planning and entitlement process, typically looking at the staff capacity, the time and difficulty in obtaining entitlement for projects that are consistent with the PDA, Jobs Housing Connection allocations. In Hayward's case, talking with the staff, but also talking with developers, that was another part of our assignment, was to get the opinions of developers. It was determined that Hayward did not have a major constraint in terms of processing development projects, whether it's a political or staff capacity one. Hayward seemed to be in pretty good shape. Again, that was not always the case, but that was the case in Hayward. Another item for this category was the likelihood of residential displacement. That is, if it is required that existing residential neighborhoods or residential development are likely to be displaced to accommodate the level of development required in the PDA, we took points off for that, essentially, because we recognize that that's a very difficult thing to do politically and otherwise. Again, in Hayward's case, that was not a problem in downtown. We looked at the level of community support, and of course, each of these PDAs has been identified and designated by the jurisdictions themselves, typically with a unanimous vote of the representative body, the council or board. So that typically wasn't a big problem in terms of the elected officials' support for the PDA, but we also wanted to dive in a little bit to make sure that they were walking the walk, I suppose, and that the actions at the council level actually corresponded with the ideas for the PDA, by looking at whether projects that were comparable in the scale and density required for the PDA allocation were being approved or were facing difficulties. In Hayward's case, we had a minor discount there because we recognized there was a fiscal concern that is not uncommon throughout the Bay Area, of course, but the fiscal concern being one of interest in retail development as a fiscal generator for downtown area that was in some cases competing a little bit with the interest in housing development, and so that was a minor discount in that case. We also looked at the history of neighborhood opposition and whether there was an organized body that actively opposed higher density development or intensification of these PDAs. In Hayward's case, that was not a problem, but in other cases, that is more of a problem. We looked at market attractiveness and investment, and again, here we looked at objective criteria as well as the opinions of the local staff and active real estate developers. We looked at real estate investment and development in the PDA and in the city over the past 10 years. How much development has occurred? What type of development? Is it the type of development that is consistent with the PDA or is it not? recent local development activity. That's really talking about the pipeline, what is being pursued right now, and again, what is the scale of the pipeline that's active in the community, as well as what is the type of development and the character of it. Is it higher density development that is consistent with the PDA allocation, or is it primarily lower density single-family housing? So that's another factor that we looked at. The general market conditions, here we're talking about prices and vacancies. Are the prices really at the level where you can support new construction, or are they below that, or are they significantly above that, in which case you have a lot of legroom or a lot of leeway to make things market feasible, which is the next criteria. Again, market prices versus construction costs. Wanted to make sure that we're not assuming a type of development that really can't be supported in that local market by existing price points. Available parcel size and configuration, here we're talking about the opportunity sites that we've identified. Are they large? Are they contiguous? Are they of proper dimensions to make an efficient type of development? Or, as is most of the case, are they challenged by the fact that they are really, most of these PDAs are urban infill situations where there are existing uses on the sites, or the sites are, for instance, along the El Camino Real corridor, and they tend to be shallow and long, and that can create challenges. So that's another physical capacity constraint that we were looking at for this market attractiveness, and can that be overcome? And finally, sort of a catch-all, the existence of major investment disincentives, such as environmental contamination, but also including crime and schools and things of that nature that don't necessarily show up directly in some of the other criteria that we've looked at, but that are certainly effective in terms of either promoting or thwarting potential attraction of residential development in a community. And again, to use the Hayward example here, there has been substantial development in and around downtown Hayward. There is an active pipeline of new projects that are consistent in character with what the PDA's allocation is. The price points are a little challenging in Hayward. They are not as high as certainly San Francisco and other communities, and that creates a bit of a feasibility challenge that we have recognized and discounted for in terms of the future growth potential. But overall, downtown Hayward is looking pretty good in terms of these market attractiveness and investment criteria. And finally, the infrastructure capacity and needs. That is something that beyond the vertical development, the buildings themselves, what is the capacity for streets and sewers and parks and schools and the whole gamut of infrastructure that is required of public development? Is the capacity there? Are there funding sources available to increase that capacity as needed? What is the relationship between the value of what might be built in the future versus the overall costs of development? And here there's a typical relationship that we look for, because so often throughout California, private development is on the hook to fund infrastructure upgrades. We want to make sure that the level of funding that would be required of them is within the range of feasibility to allow the projects to move forward. And again, in downtown Hayward's case, the capacity is pretty strong for the level of development that is allocated to them under the Jobs Housing Connection. So the overall results, when we looked at the sample of 20 PDAs, there were about 120,000 housing units allocated to the 20 PDAs that we looked at. That is between the years 2010 and 2040. And under the base conditions, that is current zoning, current market conditions, current infrastructure capacity, we felt that through the year 2040, you could achieve about 62% of the allocation in the Jobs Housing Connection. But that if we made certain policy recommendations and implementation of those policies, that we could probably get to about 80% overall for the overall sample of 20 PDAs. And again, it varied significantly from PDA to PDA because we do have a lot of different conditions represented in those PDAs. But overall, again, if we take certain actions, and we'll talk about what those might be, we felt that it was reasonable to project, and relatively conservatively, that 80% of the allocation to those PDAs could be achieved through the year 2040. So again, just to kind of highlight what some of the development constraints are that have informed our recommendations for policy intervention rather. In some cases, there are infrastructure deficiencies. The roadways or sewer or parks, things of that nature, are not don't have the capacity to support the level of development that is allocated. There's limited local government financing capacity, particularly, and this is a common theme throughout most of these PDAs, the loss of redevelopment funding and powers is a significant constraint in going forward with this, because again, we're mostly talking about infill development here that has different types of challenges in some cases than greenfield development. And the powers and financing sources from redevelopment were a major contributor to the effectuation of those development types. Lack of sufficient parcel size, again, with these being mostly infill development projects, that is a common condition, not everywhere, but in many cases that is a challenge that assembly of parcels would help with, and that again is a power that redevelopment offered that is not currently on the table in the same way. Local land use policy, in some cases, and not in Hayward's case, but in some cases, the local land use policy was not supporting the level of zoning and intensification that is required to achieve the PDA allocations. Market demand constraints, that's again price points and interest on the private side of investing here. That's something that there are fewer things that we can do directly to affect market demand. And then financial limitations generally, again, that's at the local and regional level. So our policy considerations, one of the things that we have recommended in some cases where the zone capacity does not meet the allocation is that upzoning basically be pursued. And in most cases, when we've done an amended PDA readiness assessment, that upzoning has been fairly modest. We're not talking about going from single-family homes to high-rises. We're talking about one level of multifamily to perhaps the next level of multifamily housing. Targeted planning and capital funding is another thing that through MTC and ABAG's work is already being pursued. Reinstating some form of redevelopment authority at the local level is absolutely something that we recommend be pursued. Obviously, that's a statewide issue, but coordination on that issue is one of our strongest recommendations. And then creating additional infrastructure funding for local governments, whether that's through the redevelopment type powers or ballot measures or any number of things that can be done to enhance local funding for infrastructure, are strong recommendations of our analysis as well. And then quickly, we did look at non-PDAs. About 20% of the future growth in the Bay Area through the Jobs Housing Connection is shown to be happening in areas that are not designated as priority development areas. And that ranges from, that's everything but the PDAs, basically. And that the PDAs represent about 5% of the actual land mass of the Bay Area. So non-PDAs is 95%, but they have many constraints that are similar, and in some cases even stronger than the constraints in the PDAs, whether it's infrastructure capacity. We're talking about greenfield development in many cases where there is no infrastructure, so that's a major constraint. Financing capacity, if their price points in an exterior area are considerably lower than they would be in the interior Bay Area, that's another major constraint. So the non-PDA areas, again, have many of the same constraints, different in character but similar in theme to what we see in the PDA areas. So in our opinion, it is not expected that but for this Jobs Housing Connection, everything would be fine and we would get all the housing that we need in the non-PDA areas on the periphery of the Bay Area. We do think there are major constraints there that limit the amount of housing that could be expected in those areas as well.
So back to me. Thank you, Darren, for walking us through the work. What I wanted to do now is talk about where we go from here. First of all, as noted in your packet, the final report should be finished later this month. So there's quite a bit of detail on each of the PDAs that was included in the sample set. But I wanted us to take a couple of steps back to see what this what we have learned from this work overall. And I think because our sample set included such a range of place types and market conditions, the results really offer us a better understanding of the development challenges across all these different circumstances. And while this might not be an earth-shattering finding, I mean, I think we clearly saw that there are challenges common to most, if not all, of the PDAs. But I think where that's important as we go forward with Plan Bay area implementation, that we focus our efforts on these common challenges so that we can benefit all PDAs or most PDAs in those circumstances. And so I think you'll also see in your next agenda item that this work will also help us to focus our policy and legislative priorities as we do go forward with Plan Bay area so that we can really move ahead and try to improve the development feasibility of our PDAs. So I think I will close here and open it up to your comments and questions.
You know, you've given us an overview of the analysis. When will the detailed analysis be available?
The report should be completed by the end of this month, in March.
Okay. And I'm assuming that'll be posted on our website?
Yes.
Okay. You know, I really appreciate that we've gone through this exercise. It's kind of a truthing of these PDAs, and it really is a tool that we can look at as far as the feasibility goes. And so I really appreciate the work that's been done, Darren, and I didn't recognize you at first when you sat down here, so thank you for being here. Other committee members' comments? Yes, Mark, and then Mayor Kwong. I mean, not Mark, Scott. I'm sorry. Scott. You look so much like him.
I've been called worse, Mr. Chair, I can assure you. Last week I had a conference call, and it was with Ms. Heller, and she was with the California Natural Resources Agency, and as I was talking to her, it appeared to me that what she's really talking about is something that would fit directly within our PDAs, and so when we talked on one page, we talked about looking to try to garner other areas in which we could get some money and to collaborate. And it appeared to me that the Strategic Growth Council is actually having a solicitation for Proposition 84 Urban Greening Grant Program. And are we contacting them? Because if not, I have all this information that I would give you, but it sounds like you already talked to them.
Yes, we are in touch with the Strategic Growth Council. I'd be happy to take the information and make sure we have it.
Okay. Mayor Kwong?
So my main question is, you were somewhat silent on CEQA, and given that there are a lot of proposals around CEQA and how that might impact this development, can you sort of address it? Are there tweaks or different versions of the legislation coming that would be more beneficial to the PDA development than others?
We were silent in this presentation, but in our report we are less so. We certainly recommend that CEQA be looked at very closely in terms of reform. Specifically, ideas to streamline development process in PDA areas is, that's been promoted in the past with middling success, I would say. But ways to incorporate that streamlining in PDAs and really give priority to PDAs would be a major step forward. And that can occur through creating, from at the local level, having planned programmatic EIRs done in advance, even within the existing CEQA realm, having programmatic EIRs done that projects can build off of and really enhance the feasibility of those investments is going to be key, and that's something that can be done on the public side as opposed to the private side. But in terms of CEQA reform itself, certainly the reach and the pervasiveness of opportunities to thwart projects through CEQA are something that is a major constraint for infill development and all development in California, and we see that as something that should be addressed.
So if there's something that we can more clearly delineate or different, without necessarily having to address the different legislations being proposed now, but to whether the key principles or tenets that will help us move this forward in terms of priority development. And, I quite frankly had forgotten about the ability to amass the land through foreclosure, et cetera. And I'm not sure if any of the legislation, the transit-oriented development legislation, is even looking at or addressing that, because it will be difficult, I think, in some communities or some parcels to amass that land if we haven't already. I mean, in Oakland, I think we've amassed some reasonable amount of land around our BART stations, for instance, but as we now go on to the transportation corridors with our BRT and other programs, I was thinking about, are we going to need to do much there to build, for instance, affordable housing or other things that are aligned with being transit-oriented and being smart in terms of climate controls. So I think that was a good point, so I thank you for that.
Okay. Commissioner Halstead?
Briefly, this is very important stuff, and I'm really excited that we're moving ahead with it. San Francisco CTA submitted a letter this week, I think, that went to most of the commission that raised some issues that they had, and I don't think they're here today, so I thought maybe I should just try to get them on the table. One is asking whether your next step will include an analysis of market rate versus affordable housing in various PDAs. I don't know whether that's an issue that's addressed, that will be addressed. Another one, of course, is just looking at the differences in the region. I mean, there's such a vast difference in the cost of land and distribution, et cetera, and as well as a lot of other issues in San Francisco versus other places and in the urban core. A third one, which they raise, which it rings very clear with me, is the overcrowding on Muni and BART right now in the core places and how that affects the possibility of adding the greatest potential. I don't see that quite reflected in this. So I'm just asking that in the next steps that we try to look at those and also include those in thinking about other steps, other legislative steps. So thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
A very mundane question. Is there anywhere where one can find which 20 PDAs were actually studied? I'm always curious,
Yes, I'm sure others are as well. That will be included in the final report. We didn't obviously include that here. In your packet there is a summary by place type, but you'll have to wait till the end of the month.
I saw that, but I'm always digging down. Anyway, thank you. I'll look forward to the final report. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Catherine Lyons. Catherine, would you like to come forward?
Good morning, Catherine Lyons with the Bay Area Council. First, I think I can speak on behalf of the entire Bay Area Business Coalition and saying thank you for listening to our concerns about this and taking this step and commissioning this analysis. I think it's really, really important work and critically important analysis that we should take into consideration. So, again, thank you very much for the work. And just wanted to say that we're looking forward to continue working with you all in implementing the policies that you've all laid out. And hopefully aiding in the successful implementation of the Planned Bay Area process. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. Peter Singleton. Peter?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Good morning.
I have an overall question for the commissioners and for the executive committee members. And that is that this body, or these two bodies, are proposing to essentially mandate for the entire Bay Area, that's 101 cities and towns and 9 counties and 7 million people, mandate that for the next 30 years that 70 or 80% of the housing units will be in mixed use, or at least in multi-story high-density dwellings, and that most of the commercial space will be in this kind of mixed-use, high-density, transit-oriented development as well, where over the past decades, the express preference of the residents in the Bay Area by their own decisions is for on the order of maybe 80% of the housing to be in single-family homes. And I applaud, I think, Mr. Sparing, I think you mentioned the term truthing, and feasibility, and I think those are good words to characterize at least this study. But one thing that I don't see that's in this study, and it may be there, and I respect the work of it's environmental planning and systems, I think. Yeah, I respect the work, economic planning and systems. I respect the work that you guys do. One thing I don't see is a detailed study, a market study of the existing mixed-use or high-density developments that have been done in the Bay Area over the past decade or so. And the reason for this is because many of these have not performed very well. And so what I would ask is, if you haven't done a study of projects like 1001 Laurel Street in San Carlos, it's a beautiful building, it's most of a city block, it's 92 condos, they've sold most of them, although there are several on El Camino that they can't sell at any price. This is 4 years after they've been built, and the ground floor commercial is basically empty. Same with Avalon Walnut Creek, 34,000 square feet on the ground floor. Most of that, my understanding, is it's empty. And I think the last thing that I would say is that it seems like this body is looking at how we can correct the market failure, the seeming market failure of its interest in demanding as much mixed-use, high-density projects as this body is proposing in Plan Bay Area. Why not look at adapting Plan Bay Area to the needs and wants of the market and let the market decide? And the market is simply the individual decision-making of us, the residents and the businesses of the Bay Area. And I thank you for your consideration.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. Thoughtful comments. Mary Feller? Mary? Ken, I'm going to ask you to respond to the numbers that were used there and after I take public comments. Go ahead, Mary.
Hi, I'm Mary Feller. I just want to emphasize that I'm a dyed-in-the-wool progressive Democrat. So,
well, we won't hold that against you. Most people in the room will
some
appreciate
people
it.
have. Anyway, I am not speaking for my neighborhood association today because I just found out about the meeting, and there was no way to run any of this through the board. So I really want to be clear about that. I am the immediate past land use chair of my neighborhood association in Marin County. It's unincorporated San Rafael. I have some deep concerns about the PDA process and how it was determined whether or not there was neighborhood opposition because, certainly as far as I know, none of the neighborhood associations in North San Rafael were ever contacted. And there is very big concern over the PDA around the Smart Center station. And when you talk about upzoning and saying that it's fairly modest, it's not fairly modest. What's being proposed is 60 units per acre. And I just have to tell you, as the land use chair, it's been very frustrating dealing with the city of San Rafael. I just have to be honest and say that they literally falsified the traffic reports to get a favorable level of service around the area. We had to hire our own traffic engineer, and they're still not paying attention. So in San Rafael, there is a very, very high level of concern around these issues. Of course, we're concerned about the constraints and the traffic and the traffic reports, which are inaccurate, the stresses on our open space, that sort of thing. Is this the proper time to, I think it's not the proper time to address the ballot measures that you're going to discuss.
No,
okay.
that issue is not before us, and if you could wrap up, we'd
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. Thank you.
And the CEQA. We are really concerned about CEQA reform because what we have noticed in our neighborhood is currently CEQA is already too weak. And the power is in the hands of the people who have, the developers who have all the big money, trying to for a neighborhood association to raise the money for a CEQA lawsuit is almost impossible. So thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you. Carolyn, is it Leonard? Okay, Karen. If anybody else has a speaker card, you need to turn it in right now because we're about ready to bring it back to the commission. So please turn it in now. Carolyn, you're up.
Good morning, Mr. President and Executive Committee. My name is Carolyn Leonard. I'm not here as the Citizen of the Year for San Rafael. I'm not here as the Person of the Year for San Rafael, nor as the chair of 37 homeowner associations in coalition for North San Rafael. So I have roots, deep roots in the community, the entire zip code, 94903. Our website is 94903community.org. So here we are. We'd love to see more planning coming out of this organization because our county is half green. So let's use it. Let's designate it as a destination for recreation, creativity, inspiration, and innovation. Let's not stuff people next to a freeway. All of the research is done internationally and in America. The top medical universities have concluded you put people next to a freeway, you put people next to a major artery, you double the chances of the children getting autism. You double the chances of those children having asthma. So if the development fees want to go for the lifetime care of these children, that would be appropriate. That would be a system where the consequences that are being promulgated are being borne by the people that are making the money. So we need a system, we need a loop. Go ahead and do that. But first I'd like to see your children moving to those locations. So how many of you live in high density housing?
Or near railroad and freeway?
Right. It's unhealthy. I'm really glad. I'd like to get your names and talk to you about the health of your children and your grandchildren. So in Marin, it comes down to water. We follow the money, certainly, but we're following the water. And our Board of Supervisors has just created an exemption for developers to apply to be exempt from letters of service for water, to be exempt for letters of service for sewerage, to be exempt from setback requirements. This is inappropriate.
Okay,
this is a special treatment for special people.
Okay.
So, international standard is spoken wheel. If there's a transit stop, you don't create a lively, bustling area around it where homes are currently surrounded by open space on three sides. What you do is spoken wheel, commercial at the stop, and then the people pick up their groceries and do their errands and go back out into the community. TOD, transit-oriented development, is DOA. It's an inappropriate 19th century plan. We need all to come into the 21st century and do spoken wheel development away from heavy diesel, away from the particulate matter, and put people who are close in air-conditioned units part of the time.
Thank you, Carolyn.
So you have your work cut out for you, and we appreciate it.
If you could.
We want local control. We have deep knowledge of our communities. We love them, and this organization right now isn't set up in a system or to accommodate local control, utilizing our deep knowledge of our human ecosystem. Thank you, and please vote for health of our communities and our safety.
Thank you, Carolyn. Ken, did you want to just briefly comment?
Could you announce how much time each speaker gets? Because I didn't realize.
3 minutes.
I didn't hear that.
Yeah, you were, and I was timing you, so
I know.
You took your 3 minutes.
I appreciate that. Thanks for announcing it.
Sure, Chair Spring. There are a number of items to address. I'll focus on a couple of things.
Yeah, and be brief if you could.
Sure. First, the priority development areas are locally nominated, and I think, as you're aware, that's something that's important to remember throughout this process. The Jobs Housing Connection strategy that ABAG and MTC put together involved a lot of analysis looking at demographic trends, changing market tastes, real estate values, how a variety of factors create a basis for the forecast, and the level of growth directed toward PDAs is directed from a number of perspectives. One is that this region has set aside much of its land mass as protected open space at the county level, not at the regional level. We have a growth management envelope in which we can grow. We also have a transit network that is mature, and we have market trends that suggest that people, many folks who are going to be getting older in the years ahead if they're fortunate, as well as younger workers, want to be close to their jobs, close to transit. They want a walkable urban environment. And lastly, I'll say that the work that EPS did, the market readiness assessment suggests that those communities that have taken on this level of growth, that are particularly well connected by transit, that have job capacity or provide access to jobs, those are the places in the Bay Area where the values have held in recent years. And if you talk with the BIA, if you Urban Land Institute members, that's where they're building projects again. That's where they're filing permits again. So I think it is very much a reality-based approach. I think the readiness assessment undergirds that. But, you know, relative to the next item that's coming up, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, as you all know, to implement the PDAs. It has to do with redevelopment. It has to do with CEQA, a number of things that need to happen to make it possible to build in the Bay Area.
Thank you, Ken. John? Joy? John?
You know, I appreciate, I was going to ask that question, the process, because I think there's a belief that ABAG and MTC develop these PDA areas on their own. And the process, and you've talked about it, you may want to talk about it more, was that these were developed by locally elected officials in their community and approved by the city councils. How much community input occurred, I suppose, depends on the city. In the city that I live in Richmond, although I'm with the county, there was a fair amount of community input into the Richmond City Council's decision to recommend or nominate PDAs in its area. In the jurisdiction, unincorporated jurisdiction that I represent in North Richmond, there was also actually a fair amount of community input in the locally a local citizens group. The Municipal Advisory Council made recommendations on that. So I think, you know, it may have differed by community, but all of these, I think it's important to note that the locally elected city councils in these jurisdictions were the ones that wanted these to be designated priority development areas, not ABAG, not MTC. So frankly, I think for those citizens who believe that maybe some of these shouldn't be a PDAs, you ought to consider taking that up with your own elected officials. All of us are locally elected. All of us come from a jurisdiction. I'm elected in West Contra Costa by a number of residents in cities in an unincorporated area. So, and all of these folks here basically are. So I think if there's an issue about whether these should continue to be, those are dialogues that should occur in each local community with your city council members or boards of supervisors.
Yeah, thank you, John.